Hello there, welcome back to another video. In this video we're going to be looking at completing the square. So we're going to have some questions where we use completing the square in order to solve, and we're also going to look at the quadratic formula. So we're going to have a few examples here where we solve by completing the square, and then after we're going to look at how you derive the quadratic formula and then some examples using the quadratic formula. So completing the square, this is actually part of section 4.3, and then quadratic formula, that is part of section 4.4 in your textbook. So the first question here, it says solve for x. So in number 1 we have x minus 1 squared minus 49 equals 0. The basic idea of what we're going to be doing in these questions is we want to try to isolate the x there. And so in order to do that, we're going to first need to complete the square and then try to move everything to the other side and get it away from the x. So this one is basically kind of half done for us already. We already have this square completed, so it's going to be quite a bit easier. And some of the other ones, it's going to require a few more steps. So once you have that square completed already, we have something squared. What you want to do is you want to isolate that square. So I am going to add 49 onto both sides, so I get rid of that minus 49 there. Those cancel out, and then I have x minus 1 squared equals 49. Okay, so now that we have that, to get rid of this square here, I'm going to take the square root, and we have to do that on both sides. So this square and this square root are going to cancel out, and I am left with x minus 1 equals, and then square root of 49 is going to be 7, but it's not just a 7 because we took the square root, it's a plus or minus 7. Okay, and then that's going to give us two different solutions. So we're going to have one where it's x minus 1 equals 7, and then we're going to have a second one where it's x minus 1 equals negative 7. So solving that left one, I just need to add 1 onto both sides. 1's cancel out, and then I'm left with x equals 8. Same kind of idea on the right one, I just have to add 1 onto both sides. 1's cancel out, and I get x equals negative 6. So those are our two solutions, x equals 8 and x equals negative 6. And again, you could check these using your calculator. Just plug it in and find the roots or the x-intercepts. On to the second one here. So with this one, there is no completed square, so we're going to need to complete the square. So to do that, it's using the exact same steps as what we did when we learned how to complete the square. So I'm going to first move everything all over onto one side. So I got x squared, that 10x comes over, it's going to be positive 10x. So I have that. And then what we did was, if there was something in front of the x squared there, we wanted to factor it out of the first two terms. But in this case, in front of the x squared, there's only a 1, so I don't need to factor anything out. So what we did after that was we took that middle number, the 10, and we took that and divided it by 2, and then we squared it. So 10 divided by 2 is 5, and then 5 squared is going to give me 25. So 25 is the number that I'm going to add and subtract into this in order to complete the square. So I have x squared plus 10x, and then I'm going to put plus 25 minus 25, and then we still had that minus 21, and then equals 0. So this first part here is going to be a perfect square trinomial, so we can factor that, and then this piece here, we can just put those two numbers together. So factoring the left part, it's going to be x, and then whatever sign this was, it just came down, so it's a plus, and then this came down, and as it did, you divided by 2, so it's going to turn into a 5. And then we put our brackets and our exponent of 2 up there. And then these two numbers We just needed to add those and put those together, and that's going to give me minus 46, and then equals 0. So now what we have at this step right here, this is basically what we had in the previous question. Okay, so it's the exact same steps now from this point on as what we did in number 1. So I'm just going to try to isolate the x. I'm going to move everything over to the right. Going to take the square root and then get rid of that 5. So let's add 46 onto both sides here first. Those will cancel. And then I have x plus 5 squared equals 46. Okay, and then we need to get rid of that square, so we take the square root. Don't forget, do it on both sides. And here the square and the square root are going to cancel. And then what we get is just an x plus 5 on the left, and then equals, and the square root of 46. We're just going to keep it like that, but remember, you get a plus and a minus. Okay, now if you could simplify this, you could try to simplify it. In this case, we can't though. So the last step, all we need to do is just get rid of that 5. So we're going to subtract 5 from both sides. 5s will cancel. And so I get x equals plus or minus square root 46 minus 5. Moving to number 3, we got 2x squared minus 4x minus 2. So everything's already on the left side. Then what we can do, I see there's a factor of 2 in front of that x squared, so I'm going to pull out the 2. And remember, we only factor that out of the first 2 terms. So only the very first 2 terms. So we're going to get 2 times x squared minus 2x. And then that minus 2, we do not factor it out of that. Sometimes we'll try to trick you where we'll put a number that could be factored out. Like the 2 could have been factored out, but do not pull it out. Okay, it's going to mess up your question. And then don't forget we had equals 0. So from that point, then we had to take this middle number, take that up, and then we were going to divide that by 2 and then square it. So that's just going to give me 1. So I'm going to have to add and subtract 1 down below. So I have 2 times x squared minus 2x, and then plus 1 and minus 1. And then the minus 2 was still on the outside. Now in this case we had that factor 2 pulled out, so we need to distribute now that 2 to the negative 1. So that's going to give me negative 2. And then I can put these 2 together. So what I have, we got the 2, then we got x. And remember, sign comes down in this step. This one comes down, but divide by 2. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. That's now squared. And then we put these 2 terms together. Minus 2 and minus 2 was just minus 4. And now we have completed the square. So now we just got to try to isolate the x and get the x by itself. So I'm going to first add 4 to both sides. And those 4s will cancel out there. So we have 2 times x minus 1 squared equals 4. Then we got to get rid of that times by 2 out in front right here. So we're going to have to divide by 2. So divide that whole side by 2. Divide this by 2. Our 2's cancel. And over here, 4 divided by 2, that's just going to give us 2. So we now have x minus 1 squared equals 2. Now we got to get rid of this power of 2 there, so we got to take the square root this side, square root that side. Then I'm just going to bring my work up here. So I got x minus 1. Remember, the square and the square root canceled out. And then on the other side, we have plus or minus square root 2. And then we just got to add 1 onto both sides. So those 1's again cancel. And then we got x equals 1 plus or minus square root 2. And the order that you put these two, it doesn't matter. You could have had it flipped. You could have had plus or minus square root 2 plus 1. It's going to mean the same thing. So those were our completing the square examples. Now we are going to look at the quadratic formula, and here we have the proof first for how to get to the quadratic formula. So we go from step 1 all the way down to step 9 there, but I'm going to slowly walk through each of these steps. So the reason this quadratic formula is really useful because you start with just a quadratic equation, and out of that you get this magical quadratic formula where you can solve for any x as long as you know what the a, the b, and the c is. So the way the steps are done in this proof are a little bit different than what we did on the previous page. I'll kind of mention it as we get to those parts. So what we did on the front page was we moved it so that everything was all on one side like this, and then we completed the square. You could also move the c, and that c is just the constant value, to the other side, and that is how they got this line right here. So either of those ways would be fine, but then what we did was we said we couldn't have this a value in front of the x squared. So I needed to factor that out of the first term and the second term. So I needed to divide it out of the first two terms. So I divided it out. So we essentially divide this by a, divide this by a, divide this by a, and then the a's cancel here. And then you can see what I have in this step is just the exact same as what this next step is. So I'm just going to erase that. So now we've gotten rid of the a in front of the x squared and we just have a 1. Then what we did is we took this middle term, so it was b over a, and we divided that by 2. That's the same as multiplying by a half, so you're going to end up getting this, and then we squared that. Okay, so that's that, and then if I actually do the squaring, that's b squared over 4a squared. So that is the number that I'd need to add and subtract behind it. So that is what we have right there. So plus and minus of that b squared 4a squared. From there, what we did was we said this was a perfect square trinomial, and to factor that, I just had to take this middle term down and divide by 2. So when I do that, I'm going to get b over 2a, and this plus sign I just bring down, so both of those move down. And then what I had to do was the minus 1, I had to put that together with that other constant term, which is over here. So I ended up moving that term to the other side, and when it moves over, it turns into the opposite sign when it goes from one side of the equation to the other. So we got a positive b squared over 4a squared, and then this minus ca that is still on this side. So from there, we move from step 4 to the top to step 5. And at this point, we've already completed the square on the left side. That's the same as this previous step here, number 4. But we need to put these two terms together. And in order to add those, because we got fractions, we need to first find a common denominator. So that's what we did here. This is finding a common denominator. So they've gotten a common denominator now. Then what we can do is we can add the numerators. So we're going to have b squared minus 4ac. And that's what we have in this step right here. So we've put those two terms together. Now I got to try to get this x by itself. So we got to get rid of the square. So we took the square root of both sides like that, and then the square and the square root canceled. And then we get this right here where we have that right side in a square root. And we got to have the plus or the minus because it could be a positive or a negative of whatever's coming out of the square root. And then lastly, we said we had to get rid of this number here that was with the x. So to do that, we have to subtract b over 2a from both sides. So then this side is going to have a minus b over 2a, and that's where this comes in right there. And then just in order to make this look a little bit nicer, we could put these two terms together. We just need to find a common denominator, and when you find a common denominator, you get to this here, which is the quadratic formula. So we worked our magic and we got this quadratic formula. So x is equal to minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. Make sure whenever you guys are doing calculations, all of this is under in the square root. And whenever you're writing your square root, make sure it goes all the way to the end over the numbers. Okay, and then all of that is just being divided by 2a. So whenever you are given a quadratic equation and you write it in this form, ax squared plus bx plus c, you know the one that's with the x squared is a, one that's with the x is b, and then the constant term, that is the c, which is what we're going to see here now in these questions. So it says solve for x. So in number 1, we want to get it to look like this here first, ax squared plus bx plus c, and that's what we have. So I can see that the a is 3, the b is 5, and the c is -2. Okay, so I'm just going to write that last one just because it had a negative with it. So from there, I'm going to write out my quadratic formula. So x equals minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. And then all that is being divided by 2a. So we just take these numbers that we just found here and I just plug them into this. So always just be really careful of plugging them in. So we put in that b, so it's minus, and then b was a 5, plus or minus, and inside the brackets b is a 5, so that's 5 squared minus 4 times a was a 3, times that by c was a -2. So you just got to be really careful if ever you get any negatives. And then take that and divide it all by 2 times a, where a was a 3. So we've gotten that. Then we're just going to slowly start to simplify this. So out in front we still have -5. Then we got plus or minus, and then I'm going to write the bottom part of the fraction, 2 times 3. We just had 6. Inside the square root here, I'm going to take my calculator and then type that in so we can get that out. And this is where you just got to be careful to type it. If ever you have a negative in here, you got to make sure you put brackets around the negative. In this case we don't, so I can just put in 5 squared. So I got 5 squared minus 4 times 3 times -2. Okay, and when I do that, I get 49. So I can write 49 inside of my square root there. Just going to move my calculator out of the way now. So I got x equals -5 plus or minus, and then the square root of 49 I had here, that's just equal to 7. So I got that, and then it's all being divided by 6. Okay, so then we're going to get 2 different solutions from this. We're going to calculate one where we take the positive, and then one where we take the negative. So if I take the positive here first, we're going to get this. So -5 plus 7 is 2, so 2 over 6. And then I can simplify that. That's going to give me 1 over 3. Then I'm also going to do when it is the negative. So x equals -5 minus 7 divided by 6. And in the numerator, -5 subtract 7 is -12. Dividing by that 6, we get -2. So those are our 2 solutions. So now that you've seen that one, if you wanted to attempt number 2 on your own, you could try to do that now. So solving number 2, we're going to first get everything onto the same side so that we get it in this form right here. So I'm going to get x squared, and then when that 4x moves over, it's minus 4x now. Same with the 45, it's now minus 45, and then we just got equals 0. Make sure you guys put the equals 0. If you drop that, it's no longer an equation, so make sure you keep it. And then I can see there's a 1 in front of the x squared, so that's my a. This here is the b, so -4, and then the -45, that is the c. So I'm going to write out our quadratic formula first. So there is our quadratic formula. And then we're going to start to fill this in. So it goes minus and then b, and b is -4. So it's -4. Make sure you guys don't try to skip any small steps like that, because that's where those errors start to happen. It's something really simple, but if you write it out, then you're less likely to make the mistake. Then inside the square root, we had b squared, so that's -4 squared. Make sure you guys put brackets around that. And then -4 times a is a 1, times by c, where c is -45. And then that's all in a square root. And then that is all being divided by 2 times a, and a was a 1. So just cleaning this up, these two negatives, that's going to give me a positive. So I got positive 4 plus or minus. And then I'm going to simplify inside of this radical here. So to do that, I'm just going to get out my calculator. Just got to be really careful of how we type this in. So I got a bracket and then negative 4 and then squared minus 4 times 1. You could skip that part just because it's not going to change anything. And then times by negative 45. Okay, and then when we do that, we're going to get 196. So we'll write that 196 is in that square root, all divided by, and 2 times 1 is just 2. The square root of 196 is just going to be 14. So we got this up in our numerator, divided by 2. And then we're going to take each of those. We're going to do one where we do the positive and one where we do the negative. So we're going to have 4 plus 14 over 2. That is going to give me 18 over 2. And then that just equals 9. And then for the other one, we got x equals 4 minus 14 divided by 2. And that equals negative 10 over 2, which is just negative 5. So that is it for our examples. I'm just going to write our homework here now down at the bottom. And just a quick note to not confuse anyone, for questions 5, 6, and 7, you're doing A, C, and E for each of those parts. And then for number 4, you're doing A, C, E.